Hi, everyone. Got the cell phones off and all that stuff. And thank you for coming here. I'm going to start with an aside, which will drive my director crazy, but I swore. You know, there was that time in 2020 when you were walking down the street and you saw someone about 50 yards away and you quickly went to the other side of the street. Remember that time? Well, in the heart of that darkness, so to speak, I realized how much I missed you. And I don't mean you specifically. I meant the zeitgeist of it. Because this is my milieu. And I swore that if I ever had the privilege, which I do thanks to Chris and Evelyn and Rudy, if I ever had the privilege to work solo again, I would thank you for all the times you showed up. It might have been a small group, it might have been a large group, but I cannot tell you how much through my life as a solo performer your support has meant to me. So God bless you. The roots of what you do are with the other people. The roots of what you do are with the other people. Now, Charles Nelson Reilly heard that adage for the very first time in Uta Hagen's 11 a.m. Tuesday morning beginners class at the HB Studios in downtown New York in the early 1950s. See, in the 1950s, if you wanted to be an actor, if you were tall and good looking, you went to Hollywood. If you weren't, you went to New York so that you could learn how to act. And there were a lot of great places to learn this craft. I mean, there was the neighborhood Playhouse, there was the Actors Studio, there was the Royal Academy of the Dramatic Arts. But they all cost a lot of geld. And there was a new studio downtown, the HB Studio, started by Uta Hagen and her husband, Herbert Berghoff. And it was only $3 a class. And if you didn't have the $3, the registrar, Pippa Hastings, would say, go on in anyway. Just go on in. So they all went in. 22 untested, untried, young hopefuls, all hoping to become professional actors. This was the class list that Miss Hagen read that day. Mason Adams, Jack Albertson, Barbara Berry, Orson Bean, Shelley Berman, Peggy Cass, Wyatt Cooper, Robert Culp, Charles Grodin, David Hedison, Bill Hickey, Hal Holbrook, Frank Langella, Jack Lemmon, Steve McQueen, Ann Mira, Geraldine Page, Charles Nelson Reilly, here, Miss Hunt! Jason Robards, Jerry Stiller. Jerry, don't stand in the back. There's a seat right here in the front row next to Ann Mira. Andy, raise your hand. Tom Troop and Fritz Weaver. These, yet untried, stars of the future. These guys and gals were going to make millions of dollars and win hundreds of prestigious awards. But that day, in that class, they had 3 things in common. 1, they all wanted to be professional actors. 2, they all had no money. And 3, they all, not one of them, could act for shit. But they all hoped that Miss Hagen, this first lady of the American stage, would hold the key to their future. Now, Hal Holbrook came in with a paper bag one day, and in it he had a coat and a long coat, some pants, and a really crappy $3 wig. Geraldine Page said, I think it's his George Washington. And Charles went over to ask him. He said, no, Charles, it's my Mark Twain. I get paid $25 to do my Mark Twain tonight on weekends. high schools and junior colleges, where everyone thought that was the shittiest thing they had ever heard. Jeremy Payne said, Mark Twain, that's got to be so shit. But see, what they didn't know, how could they? That was in that paper bag, besides the wig and the coat and the pants, was a Grammy, an Emmy, and a Tony, and millions of dollars. So, Charles, later in life, when he became the celebrated and wonderful teacher that he was, would always tell his young students, you want something out of this business? Get a paper bag and put your dream in it. Now, Charles Nelson Reilly, I assume some of you, who knows who Charles Nelson Reilly is? I did it the other day for a group of students. No one knew who he was. A very good litmus test. Not easy for syllables. Anyway, Charles Nelson Reilly, among all the things that you know about him, most importantly to me, he was that special person. You know, we all have them. They come into our lives. You can't predict it. You can't ask for it. You can't beg it to happen. But they come into your life. And whether they're there for a phone call or a 20-year friendship, something happens in the original connection that changes the path of your life forever. Your trajectory just gets altered forever. And you actually bring those people with you. Now, there's this phenomenon in nature where roots, separate roots, actually grow together and wed naturally. It's called inoseclusion. That completes the Mensa portion of the show. And it actually happens. It's like they wed. Well, for 16 years, since he passed away, I've kind of been sort of carrying Charles with me through. I mean, I cite him, I talk about him in rehearsals, I repeat his stories. I carry him with me. He became part of my roots. And so, tonight, I'm going to do my little tribute to him. Charles was born on January 13, 1931, the only child of Signa Elvira Nelson and Charles Joseph Reilly. His mother, Signy, was a terrible person. I mean, whenever he would ask her anything, she'd say, save it for the stage. He'd say, why doesn't Mrs. Bigelow talk to you in the elevator anymore? Save it for the stage. He never knew what stage he was supposed to be saving it for. And she would yell out the window a lot. Hey, you dago up guineas, get away from my boy. I see you, Pollock, stay away from my kid. She wasn't really very well liked in the neighborhood. So whenever she went to get her hair done, she'd take a baseball bat with her as she walked up Webster Avenue for fear of being lynched from a lamppost by a group of angry housewives before she got her head under the dryer. But when Charles was alone, he could play with his puppet show. He was doing Cinderella of the Bronx. It was going to be a musical. It was going to be on ice. It was going to be... Now, a father doesn't really like to see his only son playing with dolls. So he mentioned it to Signy, and the next thing you know, she kicked in his puppet show and actually said to this little boy, I should have thrown away the baby and kept the afterbirth. It's that kind of show. But when he was 4, she did a miraculous thing. She took him up the Grand Concourse to the Loewy's Paradise, to the movies to see Naughty Marietta with Jeanette MacDonald and Nelson Eddy. And he sat on those nice cushy chairs with the chandeliers and the heavy doors and the thick rugs and the paintings on the walls and the flickering image. And the voice, he heard it in his head for the very first time. And it said, this is a place for you. This is a place for you. When he was 4, he got cast in the lead in the school play. He was going to play Columbus in Columbus the Man. He was very excited, so he ran home to tell us, you're not going to be in a play. Your eyesight is bad. You're weak, you're sickly, and you're on beef broth. I'm going to go up to that school and I'm going to tell that dago teacher plenty. She was always telling everybody plenty. So she took her baseball bat and up Webster Avenue they went to PS 14 to tell Miss D. Benedetti plenty. Now, Charles always said that Miss DiBenedetti was the most beautiful woman he had ever known. I mean, the black ringlets of hair that fell around her collar and her lake blue eyes. And when she spoke, he swore you could hear music. Mrs. Reilly, I'm sorry to hear that Charles's eyesight is bad, that he's sickly and weak and on beef broth. And I know he doesn't have the manliness or the necessary attitude of the manliness of Columbus, but I have had this script in my desk for 12 terms, just waiting for a boy like your Charles to come through my door. I have to tell you, Mrs. Reilly, he is truly the only gifted actor I had ever had, so please let him do this play. Well, his mother didn't know whether to shit or go blind. That is an old French theater term, according to Charles. So he got to do the play. Now, they rehearsed for 6 weeks. You know, they had to get the choreography down and what it's like to walk, you know, on a ship when the ocean is underneath. And of course, they had a wonderful backdrop of the ocean and the sky and the clouds. And they had a ladder dead center in the stage where his boatswain, Fritzy Seligman from over on Norton Street, would be up in that crow's nest. And at that critical moment in the play, he'd say, "Columbus! Columbus!" He had braces on his teeth from Dr. Hepburn. "Columbus! Land ho!" Now, Miss DiBenedetti had taught Charles how to set an egg on its end so that it would stand. So at this climactic moment, Charles walked down stage as Columbus, the man, and he said, "I, Columbus, do declare that the earth is indeed round." And he put the egg on its side and it stood there and it was blackout. When the lights came up, everybody was standing and applauding and going crazy. Charles said he looked up to the spotlight to Miss DiBenedetti because she didn't trust that job to anyone, and she had tears running out of her eyes, and he saw his parents applauding. And in that moment, in PS 14, an actor was born. Now, right after this theatrical triumph that Charles experienced, his father had a great opportunity. Yes, his father was a watercolor artist, which meant that he was working for the movies. So in those days, all the advertising was done by hand, these hand-drawn posters. And his father was extraordinary. So one day, this very natty man in a suit, a little mustache, came in to talk to Mr. Reilly. "Mr. Reilly, I mean, your art, it's spectacular. Now, I'm starting a company in California, and I'd love for you to come along with me because I think we could do something really special." So he went home to tell his wife, "We're not going to California. What are we, pioneers, gold diggers? My family's here. My roots are here. We're not going to California. Give up your big ideas, Reilly. We're not going to have anything anyway." And so he had to say no to this gentleman, and no to the palm trees, and the warm weather, and a potential future. Now, does anyone know who that guy might have been?
Jack Warner.
I'm sorry, you missed the prize portion of the skip in the show. I actually had a prize for you, an actual Chips commemorative coin, but you didn't get it. Actually, it was Walt Disney.
Oh.
Yes, it's that kind of show. So he said no to Walt Disney, and you know what? The movie business changed, and advertising suddenly was the photograph, not the hand-drawn art. And so his work dried up. And then he had no work. He always said he could hear the razor blade on the glass of the door as they took away his name and his livelihood. And he went into a serious decline and started to drink and had a nervous breakdown and was institutionalized. So Charles and his mother had to ride the train up to Hartford, Connecticut. And his mother was doing the mantra as the wheels are turning. "What's going to happen to us? What's going to happen to us? What's going to happen to us? What's going to happen to us?" And they moved into a two-room, cold water flat with 5 other people. Now, the best way for me to paint the picture, I decided, is to describe the dinner table, okay? Time for dinner. Come on, everybody. Now, at one end, you had his father, who had been sort of released from the institution, but was completely sedated at all times. Next to him was his Aunt Lil. Aunt Lil had been a wonderful nurse at the Children's Hospital in New York. She had some back issues, and a doctor said, "Lil, we can take away all that pain. we have a new surgery and we really can help you. It's going to make all the difference in the world. So Charles's Aunt Lil volunteered for one of the first ever lobotomies. Yeah, it didn't work. So she was a comatose aunt. So you had your sedated father, a comatose aunt, and then you had Uncle Bernie. Now Uncle Bernie would get dressed every night for dinner. And after dinner he'd go out and he would get the paper and he would sit under the light and the easy chair and he would look, but he wasn't looking for nightclubs or entertainers. No, he was reading all the funeral notices. He was reading the obituaries to see where the family sittings were that night. And he'd go out every night and he'd sit with the dead. I mean, people he never even knew. According to Charles, he was the only one in the family with an active social life. Plus, there were his grandparents, who were old country Swedish, spoke no English, and while everybody else was eating fish sticks because Birdseye had just come into view, they were eating the old-style herring out of the jar with the heads and the bones and the stink. And when they finish it, and from the table they throw the bones of the head across the kitchen into the toilet, plop, and never miss. And everybody was speaking Swedish. Charles Nelson Reilly spent his adolescence in an Ingmar Bergman movie. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was when he was in the backyard one day. And he heard the two neighbor women next door as they were hanging their wash. Stella! 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 Don't you think that Mrs. Reilly's son is odd? Can you imagine being a coming-of-age young man and hearing that you're the odd one in a family like that? Fortunately, he started to make friends. Donald Baggish, his parents had Baggish Bakeries, the best rye bread, unless you thought it was Pomerantz, but Charles always said it was Baggish. And Donald one day had 2 tickets to go to the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus in that afternoon. Now, Charles was going that night with his father. So he was really excited about going twice in a day. So he went to tell him, "You're not going to the circus twice in a day. What are you, a carny? You're going to the circus tonight. That's plenty. That's the end of that." Well, being an adolescent, he went anyway. And his mother ran out on the porch, screamed for all the neighbors to hear, "I hope it burns to the ground!" Well, you'll like her, Donald, once you get to know her. She really isn't that bad. So they didn't have actual tickets. They had end seats, which meant they could sit on either end. So they came in and they looked. And, oh, that's good. So they went up there and they got their seats. And the crack of the whip and the roar of the tiger and the elephants and the music and the clowns. And Charles was in heaven. And then the greatest act in the circus was about to take center stage. The Flying Wallendas. And when they worked up on that high wire, there was nothing on any of the rings below them. And Charles said, as that first ballerina-type lady in her yellow sequin canary outfit put her foot on the high wire, Donald yelled, "Fire!" And Charles looked and there was a big ball of fire coming, and they jumped down the side and they scurried out under the tent. They ran as fast as they could, and when they turned around, it was gone. The whole tent was gone. All that was left was a couple of poles. It had evaporated. Emmett Kelly, the famous clown, walked by with a bucket of water. There was a little girl whose face was melting. She was on fire and she was screaming, "My mother's going to kill me, my mother's going to kill me." And Charles said to himself, "Who cares, you're already dead." The band played the Marine hymn because that's what you do in an emergency. 178 people lost their lives that afternoon in that fire. You see, Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey had waterproofed the tent in an age-old formula that they used, which was 2,000 pounds of paraffin, and 6,000 gallons of gasoline. See, it was used for decades because that waterproofed well, but it had nothing to do with fire. But Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey didn't care about that. They just wanted the gate, because if it rained, they'd have to give the money back, and they didn't. And all those people lost their lives because of that greed. Donald Baggish never told anyone what Charles' mother had said that day. He was a very good friend. And that night, Charles said, his parents had the biggest fight of their lives. And they never spoke again. Schwartzy was his other friend. And Schwartzy and he both wanted to get jobs as ushers at the Bushnell Theater, 3,500-seat Roadhouse Theater, where all those great acts came through. And Charles was tall, so even though he was only 13, he passed for 15 and got a job as an usher. Within a short amount of time, because of his dedication, he became the head usher. And he had his perch with his flashlight up on the first mezzanine. And he'd look over all the proceedings below. And he heard something for the first time in his life. 3,500 people laughing at once. There was no laughter in the Reilly home. And when the Yiddish theater company would come through with Little Molly Pecan, he said you could piss your pants. They were that funny. And he knew that he had to know how you do that. How do you make 3,500 people forget their troubles long enough, put aside their lives and all of their issues, to come together and laugh? And he wanted to know how he could do that, and that's what drove Charles to New York, and that's the ultimate backstory of that young man sitting in Uta Hagga's class on Tuesday morning as he started to learn how to act to take on New York. 50s were active for Charles. He did 22 off-Broadway musicals. Walter Kerr wrote of one, "If I see Charles Nelson Reilly's young, energetic face in one more opening number, I'm going to be sick." Critics. And then in 1955, he got a big break. He had a chance to audition for the head of NBC television, because NBC was really getting into television, and they wanted good talent. So this was a big mock-up, 55th floor, corner suite office. Charles went in to meet this guy, and he was seated there at his desk. He was doing his work. He looked up, and went right back to his work. They don't put queers on TV. It was a very short meeting. Charles retreated to the lobby downstairs, and he sat on the couch. And the voice in his head said, "This man's words, they're not accurate." He always told me that it didn't bother him. He always said that what really bothered him was when he got back home that night and he went to make dinner and the roaches had gotten into his minute rice. That bothered him because they were starving. These actors, they came up hard. You know, they would actually, members of that class would sell their own blood to buy theater tickets to support each other. I often wonder what actors would do that today. In the late 50s, like 58, Uta made Charles a teacher. She gave him a beginner's musical comedy class that was all his, and he went on to teach Lily Tomlin, Bette Midler, Gary Berghoff, Renee Fleming, and many other celebrated people, King Chase. 60s arrived with a boom. He did almost 5,000 performances on Broadway in that decade. Think about it, 5,000! He was cast in the original production of Bye Bye Birdie. He did the original production of How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, for which he won a Tony at a drama desk for Best Supporting Actor in a Musical. Then he did Hello Dolly for 3 years. He said it was so tedious, but it did get him a penthouse in Manhattan, which is where he sat when the phone rang at 1:30 in the morning with one of the most significant calls he would ever receive. It was Cy Fuhrer calling from Detroit with a musical that was in trouble. You see, after that afternoon's performance, their leading man, Victor Spinetti, had decided to leave the show, leave the city, and leave the country. And they had 3,500 paying people the following Tuesday in less than 48 hours, and they had no leading man. So Cy begged Charles to come to Detroit in the winter to a musical that was in trouble. And he showed up, and in 27 hours with black coffee and Chinese food, he learned the entire libretto, the book, he learned all the blocking, he learned all the songs, And he was ready for his first rehearsal with his leading lady, Julie Harris. And he was so excited to work with her, and he really wanted to make a good impression. So he entered, you know, the military man with his sash and his sword. And maybe it was because it was a different actor, but Julie went up on her lines. She got lost. So Charles knew he had to seize the moment because he really wanted to make an impression on her. So he stormed down to the front of the stage and he looked over the footlights and he looked out to the center of the table where all the professional people were, the technicians and everything. And he went, "Si, where did you get her?" And he's like this, "I got cues, I got to get changed, I got cues, I got to pick up, it can't be like this, help me." Now Julie Harris is standing there, she's saying, "I knew he was off the wall, this guy's crazy." So they got through the first act and it went actually pretty well. So anyway, after they finished the first act, they go up to the dressing rooms and Julie Harris led the way. And Charles followed her. And she came out of her dressing room with a bottle of champagne. And she said, "Charles, I think we're going to be okay." And boy, were they ever. He ultimately directed her in 16 one-person shows. Plus, his revival of the Gin Game that got nominated for him as a Tony for directing in a year that it was for Brits and Charles, and he was in his late 60s at the time. They were like this for the rest of their lives. Now Julie would come into the dressing room with Emily Dickinson poems because she loved Emily Dickinson. And she was trying to convince Charles to create a one-woman show about Emily Dickinson. And he got kind of hooked. And so he got Bill Luce, the playwright, involved, and Timothy Helgeson, and they formed what was called Team Emily. And they went about creating the Belle of Amherst. They rehearsed at the Masonic Temple in Los Angeles. They took it on the road. They went to Seattle, Chicago, Boston, everywhere they went. It was an incredible hit. I mean, in Boston they were held over. The reviews were love letters. So when they came into New York, they were truly had a lot of excitement and anticipation that this was going to be something special. Opening night, standing ovation. People weeping. Maureen Stapleton wiping her eyes. Someone asking her, "Do you have a cold?" She said, "No, it's Julie. Whenever she's on stage, I just can't help but cry." So everyone went to the Sardi's, which is what you do after the play opens, and wait for the reviews. Now, the tradition was, about 11 o'clock, they'd wheel the televisions over to the table so you could see the TV reviews. Then afterwards, the newspapers, the hard copies would come to the table, and you'd see how it was. Well, there were no TVs being wheeled over. Charles went to find the press agent and said, "What's going on?" And the press agent said, "I'm sorry. They're not good. We're not going to bring the TVs over." So suddenly Charles is sitting there, and the F word is in his head. Flop. And then the newspapers came. "Clive Barnes." Well, one said of me, the minute Paul Linke opens his mouth, you hate him. But we won't win it. Clive Barnes, this was his headline. "For whom the bell toils." Miss Harris obviously is looking for a vanity production. She wants to be the first lady of the American theater. It was a mistake for Helen Hayes, and it's a mistake for Miss Harris. There is no Belle on Broadway. And that paled compared to Douglas Watt. Douglas Watt said, "This isn't a play at all." He didn't buy the one-person form. He thought, who wants to watch an actor on stage talk to people who aren't there? He said, if Emily Dickinson came to my home with that sewn-together collection of poetry, I would tell her to leave it at the front door and run along like a good little girl. So ticket sales were absolutely flat. And they were struggling. And then Walter Kerr came, and Rex Reed. And they each wrote love letters. It was this play of the season. Rex wrote a full article about Julie Harris's progress as an actress, from her St. John to her Emily Dickinson. Charles came in to the theater, and he found Julie half in the dressing room, half outside, on the fire escape, with her little Brownie Instamatic hanging from her neck. And she says, "Come here, Charles, you gotta see this, come here." And he looked, and around the block, I mean, down as far as you could see, and then the curve, there were people standing in line to buy tickets to see the Belle of Amherst. And you know what? It went on to win a Grammy, an Emmy, and a Tony, and a couple bucks. So, in the late 70s, Burt Reynolds opened a theater in Florida. And he wanted Charles to come down and direct in the theater and teach in the school. And opening night of the theater, he took Charles aside. He said, "Charles, I'm naming this the Charles Nelson Reilly stage. Because you see, this is the stage your mother always told you to save it." The 80s were television central. He got off the plane to do a Dean Martin special. He got out and he looked at this. It was January. It was 72 degrees. He looked around and he went, "How long has this been going?" He made more money in that one weekend than he would in 6 months on Broadway, so he redirected his life towards California. He got cast in the Ghost and Mrs. Muir. He was only supposed to do the pilot, but Hope Lang said to the producers, "He's funny, keep him." So they wrote a part for him as the nephew. And then he started to do the Tonight Show. He did 94 appearances on the Tonight Show. He also started to do the game show circuits and the guest star circuits. And he was just living the life of Reilly. He was in his Beverly Hills home. It overlooked the West Side. He had a swimming pool. He had a husband, Patrick Hughes. They had a great life. They had their 2 dogs, the Menendez brothers. True. And life was great. And then one day the mail came. Now, this was Charles's favorite day of the week because it had the TV Guide in it. And so he was going through the TV Guide, looking for all the time. So he'd take his Manhattan and his pen, and he was going to check how many times he was going to be on the TV that week. So he'd go through it, and he'd just circle every time he was going to be on. And then one week, he was going to be on 28 times. So he sipped his Manhattan for a moment, and he sat back and he thought, And they said they don't put queers on TV. Now I have to wonder who you have to fuck to get off. So one day he's reading this magazine, his favorite TV. There's a one-man show on HBO this Sunday night. Time Flies When You're Alive, written and performed by Paul Linke. The plot turns. Anyway, so a couple days later, he happens to be home and he's watching this Stephanie Edwards show. It's an hour show at 11 on KCAL 9, and I'm on it for a full hour. So he's watching it, and then I know none of this, of course. I don't know him. I'm aware of who he is, but that's as much knowledge as I have. And I'm in the lobby of KCAL with my director, Mark Travis, and the phone rings at the guard desk. And the guard says, "Is there a Paul Linke here?" So I go over and I say, "Hi, this is Paul Linke. This is Charles Nelson Reilly. I just want to meet the man that does one-man theater better than me. Can we have lunch?" Cut, next thing you know, I'm at Adriano's in Beverly Glen. It's at the top. It's now a nightclub that Doc Severinsen bought, but in those days it was Adriano's, and I go in and Charles is comfortably ensconced in his big booth. He's breaking bread. "What do you mean you don't eat calamari? It's so fucking good. All right, there's more from me." So this one-man show of yours, Paul, I want to tell you, what a beautiful play you've written. There's acting in that chart house scene that's as good as I've seen. Tell me how this happened. So I tell him the miracle of Time Flies When You're Alive. Gave a eulogy at my wife's memorial. Mark W. Travis, the director, heard it, suggested I do a one-man show like Spalding Gray. I didn't know who Spalding Gray was, so I could see his movie, Swimming to Cambodia, and sitting in the theater at the Beverly Center, I knew that I could do that. It was like this life-changing epiphany. I knew it. I just knew how to do that. I wouldn't do it the way he does it, but I would do that. I could do that. And then we started to have these various Chicken Caesars over a year where we talk about, we got to do that play, got to do that play. October 14th. 1987, opening night of Time Flies When You're Alive. It was white hot. It was like The Shining. I really remember very little about it. It's kind of like tonight, just wild intensity and crazy. And when it was over, what I remember is John Ritter came to me, my lifelong friend, fellow parent, Diamond Dog player on my softball team, my true good friend. And he looked at me and he said, "This is your Mark Twain. You will do this the rest of your life. Nancy and I will help you in any way we can." Next thing you know, the LA Times comes a week later with a half full house. Sylvie Drake, my angel, wrote a review that actually changed my life. Because suddenly you could not get a ticket. And suddenly my 6 Wednesday nights, I was only going to do 6 catharsises. And my friends were also concerned about me putting my grief out there. What none of us knew was how that was going to connect with the audience and how much they needed this. And so suddenly I was doing 13 at the Powerhouse. Then the Tiffany Theater came up and said that they would give me their space. Wednesday nights, Sunday matinees. For a year, I sold out. Then the stars all came. You know you're doing well when Barbra Streisand cold calls you at home looking for a couple of seats for her and Don Johnson. You got to think you got something going on. And HBO came out of the woodwork, and then they wanted to make a movie of my play. And they showed it on a Sunday night in what would later be the Sopranos time slot. And Charles, you saw it, and here we are. And he looked at me. We ordered cappuccinos, and then he told me about the miracle of the Bell of Amherst, what he called the miracle on 48th Street at the Long Acres Theater. And he told me the whole thing about the reviews and how they had, overcome them, and its great success. With our coffees done and pushed to the side, we sat back, and we had really bonded. We were the Miracle Boys. And that was that. I went away. I thought, wow, it was really great. He's a really interesting guy. His compliments meant a lot more to me now that I knew some of his background, but that was it. I didn't understand that our roots were already starting to circulate. Anyway, phone rings, 1990, in May. Charles is asking me to go to Dallas, Texas to replace an actor that he'd lost in a 2-character show. He said, "I'm here at the Long Walk, Paul. It's Charles. I'm with Julie Harris. I'm directing in one of those another goddamn poet plays. This one's Ezek Dinison. But I've lost my actor. Would you come to Dallas?" And I went to Dallas to do Joanna's husband and David's wife. And I thought about how to describe that experience, and I'm going to rip off a review that someone wrote about the Bell to just describe it. It was a labor of love by 4 fairly skilled lovers, all working at the top of their game. It was just a miraculous experience, and being his actor, I mean, he sat on the stage with us when he directed. I never had that experience. He was just a magnificent director. Next phone time the phone rings, it's 1999. He's returning my call. I asked him, I said, I'm doing my Pacific Resident Theater has given me a couple of months, and they want me to do all 3 of my shows in rep. Time Flies When You're Alive, Life After Time, and my new show, Father Time. And Charles, would you please direct it? Well, he said yes. And he said, but I don't want to work in the theater. I want to work on my boat in the marina, the La Boheme. So he said, I'll cook for you, and you'll tell me the stories, and we'll make up a play. So I go the first time with all my notes, ready to do all this. And before I get a word out edgewise, when we were doing the Bell, Paul, it was the 4th of July, it was the bicentennial year. And the post office was releasing an Emily Dickinson stamp at the same time. So we were invited to go down to meet the Queen. And so the White House is incredible. You get there, and all the women were taken to one side, and all the men were on the other side. And it was all done by alphabetical order. So I was with the R's. It was Reagan, Reilly, and Rockefeller. Governor Rockefeller, you're Nelson. I believe Nelson of the Britney. I believe. Now, I'm Nelson of the Bronx. I think it's a fascinating subject. We're going to have to get into it at dinner. Ron, how are the horses? Ron, ever since I arrived in California, even though I was born in the Bronx, I have to tell you that I just love California. And even with the fires, and the floods, and the mudslides, and the landslides, and the riots, and the police corruption, and the parking at the music center, I just think California is just an amazing place. And then they all went over to meet the Queen, a real one. And she got out on the portico, and she had more diamonds on her. Charles always said he'd look at that. He said her tiara was like basically an inner tube of diamonds. And all he could think about was, how did she get all that shit in the overhead bin? So when the TV cameras turned on their lights, And the reflection on the diamonds was, oh my God! And Miss Harris was there next to him now, and she was looking at the Queen. I could play it better. So that was my rehearsal. So I go away from the boat. I'm thinking, this is really going to be very difficult because I need to rehearse. I have an opening company in a couple weeks, and he won't even let me get a word in. So next rehearsal, I'm going to come in and start telling the story. So I come to the boat, and he starts cooking the rouse and the chicken, and he's got the pasta going. I said, Charles, in 1971 it was Christmas Eve, and my mother was drunk. And my father was acting weird, and he gave her a 5-carat diamond ring, and she's cursing at him, and I can't figure out what's going on. I gotta tell you something, Paul. That reminds me of a story. And you see, he used to tell me Christmas in Connecticut. You see, when he was in his teenage years, his father had recovered enough. And when it was Christmas time, his father would go to all the rich neighborhoods and look in the trash bins. He'd go looking for any good premium booze bottles. The labels were still good. He'd take them home and he'd scour them out and sanitize them, and then he would line them up, and he'd go buy a bunch of cheap alcohol. And with a funnel, he'd go down the line and he'd fill each one up to various levels, so it looked like he had a really full bar. And when Christmas Eve came, he'd set up the card table with a little cloth over it. He'd line up his bottles and his glasses and a little Merry Christmas sign, and the Christmas tree was there, and his father would come like he had done everything ready for the party, and he would sit there and he'd wait for people to come. But no one ever came. Charles said no one ever knocked on his door his entire life. No one rang the doorbell. So after a while, his father started to drink the booze by himself. And as it was approaching midnight, he finished all the alcohol, and he was completely shit-faced. And he knocked the table over, and he staggered to the tree to make some adjustment, and he pulled the tree down. Every year at midnight, the tree would come down like clockwork. Now, years later, Charles is famous. He's in Beverly Hills. Hope Lang is having a 75th birthday party, and his mother, who's out for the holidays, has joined him at this party. He was walking through the party, and he noticed that his mother was sitting between Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau. So he felt she was in very good company. So he goes over to Shirley Booth, and she says, Charles, I met your mother. You are so right. I mean, she's the worst person I've ever met. And he said, I know, Shirley, but what a great part for you. So they're now in the car. The valet has just shut the door. And his mother's first words are, you showbiz people are so weird. And he's thinking, this is Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon. They can't make her happy. And now they're driving west on Sunset, and they get to Sunset Plaza Drive, and the light turns red. Now, it's Christmas time, so the Playboy building, which was there at the time, has a big Christmas tree up on the top. And as they sit at the light, idling, a Santa Ana wind suddenly burrows through like it did today. And the tree gets knocked off the building and comes down and lands straight on the hood of Charles' car. So he looks at his mother, and then he looks at his watch. See, Ma, right on time. It's 9 o'clock in Pacific Standard Time. Man, it was midnight back east. Okay, now I'm sitting there going, this is really, I'm never going to have a show. How am I going to have a show? So I said, Charles, you know something? You're the one who should be doing a one-man show. Your stories are way better than mine. I'll only do it if you direct it. Emily Dickinson once said, you never know how tall you are until you're asked to rise. I would have said anything in that moment. I had to rehearse. I said, I'd be happy to direct your play. Can we just work now? 2 days later, the phone rings. Paul, it's Charles. We're going to Boca. We're going to go do our show. What? What do you mean? We're going to Boca Raton. We're going to the Caldwell Theater. We're going to go do the show. What show? The show you're going to direct me in. The show we're going to make up. We're going to South Beach, baby. So I called Pacific Resident Theater, and we put my... Well, Charles had nicknamed my 3 shows, by the way, my Time Trilogy. Kind of nice, huh? So we put my Time Trilogy on pause, and I went to Boca with Charles, and in 9 days we made a play. Now, The first preview, I got a very strict lesson from Charles. I went out like this. Hi everyone, I'd like to welcome you to the first preview of Save It for the Stage with Charles Nelson Reilly. I hope you enjoy the show. I get backstage and he's like this. Are you embarrassed about this play? What do you mean? Well, there's something, is there something you're not telling me? I mean, do you like this play? Or are you just ashamed of our work? What? What are you talking? You don't go out and introduce a play like that. If you go out, you say, hi, I'm Paul Linke, co-author and director of Save It for the Stage. Welcome to our preview. It was a lesson I never forgot. He told me, you have to stand behind your work. You have to believe in your work. And you have to attach yourself to it. Opening night. Now we all have our favorite nights in the theater. I mean, come on, this is a theater crowd, right? I mean, for me, Will Geer at the Garden Theater Festival in 1974 doing his Walt Whitman Americana and the 8-minute standing ovation as he walked through the crowd like the Pope. Or Elizabeth Franz at the end of Death of a Salesman in the Goodman production, throwing herself to the ground in the graveyard scene, leaving me unable to even move. Angels in America and Perestroika, the first day they were ever done together at the Marquette Perform, the day after Bill Clinton was elected president for the first time, and Tony Kushner was on the stage, and Gordon Davidson was on that stage, and the world was so positive. Those moments that stay with you, that are indelible. Well, opening night at the Caldwell was another one of those, because when that show ended, those people rose to their feet as one, and in unison they offered him their love, their gratitude for this gift that they'd been given, and they wouldn't stop clapping. He always kidded about the fact that it was hurricane season, and he suddenly felt like we were Hurricane Charley, and we were taking South Beach by storm. And sure enough, the 3 Wednesdays that we were supposed to do became 13, again a lucky number, and he came back to LA and we had a show. Now, the run of the show, I've all kinds of ways trying to figure out how to present this, so I'm just going to do it very simply. Directing Charles Nelson Reilly is impossible. I mean, you don't do it. You're kidding yourself if you think you will. In his show, about him, that he's writing in front of you, forget about it. I kept feeling like I was trying to fly a 757 in a snowstorm. And I had 1 hour of flight training. You know, I just felt like, and really, the one big thing, our bone of contention, was the length of the show. I'm the director. You know, I advocate for you when I'm on that side. Even up here, I don't want to keep you too long. I'm advocating for you. But, you know, the show could be 2:20 or it could be 3:40. You never knew. I mean, I had Lady Kazan go one night because she wanted me to direct her in a one-woman show. She called me the next day, you directed that thing? I said, what do you mean? It was 3 hours and 50 minutes long. I said, well, it was 2:20 2 nights ago. So I was always trying to get it to make it a little shorter, you know, and it was that one struggle that we could never quite get over. But you see, I had an agenda. I was in my 50s. I was still in my striving. I was still seeking. I wanted this to change his life around. I wanted people to understand the magnitude of his talent. It frustrated me to think that people saw him as a game show fixture. To me, he was so much more. He directed opera. You know, he was a director. He was an actor. He was a consummate artist. Not just some character. But he was in a different stage of his life. He was 70. His lens was turning inward. He was on the back 9. He knew it. The tide was coming in. And he was going to enjoy every moment in that relationship that I thanked you for earlier. He loved being out there. So wherever we went, if the show was 2:20 or 4 hours, when the show ended, they leapt to their feet and they loved him, and it was just. In San Francisco, the papers wanted him to be a flag-waving gay man. Charles never saw it that way. You know, he was a gay man, but he didn't care who you slept with. That wasn't how he judged people. He cared about your character. And he was the most generous man. I mean, everywhere we went, he paid for every meal I ever ate, except if I could arrange ahead of time to pay, because otherwise there was no way I could pick up the check. And what I noticed most was when we traveled places, the men that would come up to him, and that's when I got it. See, they don't put queers on TV in the 50s. And yet, he succumbed. He overcame that, and he got himself into that little box. And so I suddenly started to realize, you know, the impact of him playing just simply, not gay characters, but just slightly flamboyant characters. It connected with the boy in South Dakota, or the boy in Louisiana, or the boy in San Diego, or the boy in Vermont, who would see him in that box and wouldn't feel so alone. I mean, what a great service it was to make them not feel so isolated. I'm in New York doing K-Pax, a movie, and again the phone rings. Paul, it's Charles. They're making a movie of our play. Really? Yeah, we're renting the El Portal, and we're going to make a movie of our play. They're going to call it The Life of Reilly. Sure enough, we had 3 nights of filming at the El Portal in 2004. He was very sick, though. The pneumonia had already started to kick in. This was a mean, nasty pneumonia. And so the first night he was really off. Second night they canceled because he was too sick. So they had one performance to get the film. And I went over to his house that day. And this is one thing I'm most proud of. I was a coach. I went in there and I went through the script, scene by scene, joke, punchline, setup, punchline, setup, story, how you had to tell the story, how they had to... Okay, Michael Jordan won an NBA championship game with 103 fever and the influenza. Tiger Woods won the United States Open on a broken leg. And that day, with this virulent pneumonia in his system, that old pro took the stage and he absolutely nailed it. And you can see it on YouTube. It's called The Life of Reilly, Charles Nelson Reilly. You have to watch it in chapters, because that's the way they posted it, but you can see the whole show. And I always envied these guys, these filmmakers, because you know something, Rosie? They could edit him. It was always going to be the same. In 2007, Patrick Hughes called me to tell me that Charles had died. And my world got a whole lot less funny. I lost John Ritter in 2003 and Charles in 2007. That's a lot of laughter to give up. You know, there was a scene in our play, Save It for the Stage. It was near the end. I always thought it should be the end. Sorry, Charlie. It should have been. But anyway, it's after a day teaching. And Charles has his been had. And he sits on his couch and he thinks about the day and wonders if he'd been a good teacher. Because teaching acting, it's ephemeral. It's ethereal, it's a quicksilver. And he'd get nervous. He'd think, I wonder if these youngsters look at me and think, what can this guy from Celebrity Bowling possibly teach me about acting? But you see, he said, and this really got to me, he said, when I sit there with them, what they don't know is that I don't sit alone. I sit with Miss Dee Benedict, and I sit with Uta Hagen. I sit with Julie Harris and Cy Fuel. They're my roots. They're what I do. And I suddenly realized, all these years, I've identified as a solo performer. And I suddenly laughed at that notion, because I realized quite clearly that when I sit here in performance with you, I'm not alone. I sit with John Ritter. I sit with Garth Campbell. I sit with Dennis the Little Guy Redfield and Ben Gazzara. I sit with Charles Nelson Reilly. Because they're my roots of what I do. And in my prayer, they do their work through me. I draw on them so that they're part of me as I extend my roots to you. So if I could ask anything of you today, I would say later on, after dinner, after you digest, if you think about this show at all, think about your roots. I mean, think about who you brought here tonight. And say their name. And honor those memories. Because isn't it that our job as human beings to celebrate our roots as a way to nurture them and sustain them? Now, before I go, I want to end with a poem by Emily Dickinson, if I may. I have no idea if this show is 20 minutes or an hour. I have no idea. I don't know what I caught, what I didn't cut. You were really the first audience. I hope it wasn't painful. Anyway, here it goes. If I could stop one heart from breaking. If I could stop one heart from breaking, I shall not live in vain. If I can ease one's life aching, or cool one's pain, or help a fainting robin unto his nest again, I shall not live in vain. I love you, Charles.